Alright, this video is called How to Learn Encoding Chunking into Concepts. So recall that learning and teaching have three main essential elements: encoding, storing, and retrieving. Let's define chunking. Chunking is determining and understanding the basic building blocks and options that define something or make it work well. So chunking is breaking something into its essential parts and being aware of those parts and those basic elements so that you can build stuff out of them and be successful and thrive in the world. So some examples of chunking you're probably familiar with, even though you didn't know you were doing it. So a zone defense or a man-to-man defense, a box and one, press defenses, those defenses in basketball, those are all chunks. You run out onto the court and you've got those options. Your coach has those options at hand, pre-made, and when he calls out, man to man, or if he calls out zone, or if he calls out box and one, um, the players kind of know what to do right from the beginning because they have those chunks and those options at hand. In math, you've got slope intercept form, y equals mx plus b, where m is the slope and b is the y-intercept, right? That breaks things down into really manageable chunks, and it helps people understand how a linear function's working. You can look at that and have a good idea what the line looks like and how the function works. Topic, sentences, signal phrases, evidence, analysis, transitions in analytic and argumentative paragraphs, in writing. Those, if you have those chunks at your command, you're going to be a better writer, and you're going to know, like, this sentence is evidence, this sentence needs to be analysis of the evidence. And if you don't have those chunks, your papers are probably going to be really confused. In science, in physics and in chemistry, protons, electrons, neutrons, and quarks and leptons and all those other particles, those are chunks, right? The world is a pretty difficult place to understand, and you start breaking it down into these particles, and now you can have a periodic table, and on you go. So why is chunking important? So as we've already sort of hinted, it provides pre-made choices for how to proceed. Again, try to imagine you run out onto the football field and you don't have the difference between run and pass. You don't have chunks like run and pass. Which kind of play are you going to run? You don't have chunks between like quarterback and left tackle. So those are like really important if you play football. Hard to even imagine getting along without them today. But at some point, somebody had to make them up to help like understand how to play the game better. And so that's why they're important. Um, yeah, it's just really hard to think of all the different ways: red light, green light, yellow light. Like those are chunks, right? For how to deal with an intersection. Somebody had to invent those, and once you invent those, well, it goes much better at the intersection than it would have otherwise. So the history of thought in many ways is the history of chunking. People have figured out how to uh, uh, put the world into concepts so that we can better understand it and address it and succeed in it and thrive in it. And there's a lot more chunking to be done, right? So if you could become a famous person by inventing a kind of chunking scheme for coding, for a new coding language, or like or a new kind of microprocessor, or whatever it might be, right? So there's new chunks to be made, and as you read and as you study, you're always going to be really tasked with getting the chunks right. What are the chunks, and how do we break this down so we can understand it and recall it and use it? So what can you do to chunk better? Well, first, pay attention to the chunking that's already there. Your textbooks chunk for you. Like there's headings, and there's chapters, and there's vocabulary that's in the back and a glossary. So there's all that chunking that goes on in novels, right? There's recurring themes and motifs and things like that you start learning to look for. So that's first. Pay attention to the chunking that's there. Um, and then as you study, you should be asking yourself, what are the best chunks for me, for my understanding, to approach this material? And how can I best chunk this material to understand it? Um, then actually use the chunks and draw upon them. So it's pretty common in eighth grade for kids to view sort of chunking and that sort of task as its own activity, separate from then doing anything. And you just sort of don't use the chunks that you actually have. So in writing, kids can actually pass the writing quiz on chunking for an argumentative paragraph, but then they actually don't use those chunks when they write an argumentative paragraph. That's pretty counterproductive and silly, right? So actually use the chunks that you come up with, and then you have to refresh your memory so you remember the chunks so that they can be useful going forward, which is, again, our definition of real learning. So takeaways. Can you define chunking? Can you give examples of chunking? Can you explain why chunking is important for learning? And can you outline how you can use chunking well?